I'm documenting this because people need to understand what really happened before I take my next steps. My phone shows 470 missed calls from my mother Patricia, 390 from my father Robert, and 230 from my sister Claire. They've been trying to reach me constantly since Friday morning, and now it's Monday afternoon. I haven't picked up once and I don't plan to. Let me take you back to last Thursday, my 26th birthday. My parents insisted on hosting a big family dinner at their place. They said it would be wonderful to gather everyone since we hadn't done a large family event in quite some time. Looking back, I should have sensed something was off when my mom specifically told me to arrive at exactly 6 o'clock and dress nicely. She kept stressing how important this was, how I absolutely needed to be punctual. I arrived at 5:55. The street was lined with vehicles. I counted at least 15 cars. When I stepped inside, the living room and dining area were filled with relatives. Aunts, uncles, cousins, my grandmother, family friends I hadn't seen in years. Someone had arranged an elaborate buffet table. Everyone was dressed formally. It resembled a wedding reception more than a birthday dinner. My sister Claire stood near the entrance wearing this strange smile. She told me to come into the dining room because our parents wanted to make an announcement. I figured they were going to embarrass me with a toast or display old childhood photos. Typical parent behavior. Robert stood at the head of the table and clinked his glass. The room fell silent. He began talking about how they'd raised me for 26 years, how they'd sacrificed everything, how they'd given me every opportunity. But his tone was wrong. It wasn't warm or celebratory. It was cold and scripted, like he was reading a legal document. Then Patricia stood up. She walked to the wall where family photos hung. She grabbed my high school graduation portrait, ripped it down, and threw it into a trash can they'd positioned nearby. Then another photo, and another. With each one, she said something cutting. You were always ungrateful. You never appreciated anything we gave you. You're a failure who drained us financially. The room was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My grandmother had her hand over her mouth. My cousin was recording it on his phone. I just stood there, trying to process what was happening. Robert pulled out a manila folder and handed it to me. Inside was a printed document titled Invoice for Parenting Services Rendered. It itemized every expense they claimed to have spent raising me. Diapers, formula, clothing, school supplies, car insurance, college tuition, line items spanning 26 years. The total at the bottom read $114,000. He told me this represented every cent they'd wasted raising an ungrateful son who never amounted to anything. He said I had two options, pay them back in full or never contact them again. He said they were done being my parents. I was officially cut off from the family. Claire stepped forward with her hand outstretched. She told me to give her my car keys. I was confused until Robert explained that the car I'd been driving was technically still in his name. He'd been letting me use it, but now he was transferring the title to Claire. She needed a better vehicle anyway. Claire took the keys right from my hand and dropped them in her purse. That's when I noticed Daniel sitting at the far end of the table, my boss from work. He was there at my parents' birthday dinner for me. Patricia gestured toward him and said they'd invited him so he could hear the truth about what kind of person I really was. Daniel stood up and told me he'd had a lengthy conversation with my parents earlier that week. They'd explained some concerning things about my character and work ethic. Based on their input and his own observations, he was terminating my employment effective immediately. I should clear out my desk Monday morning. Here's what you need to understand. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't ask why or beg them to reconsider. I looked at that room full of relatives and family friends who'd come to witness my humiliation. I looked at my parents, my sister, and my former boss. Then I turned around and walked out. I called a ride share from the sidewalk. I went back to my apartment and started making plans. You see, my parents didn't know something crucial. I'd been preparing for a situation like this for 3 years. Not exactly this scenario, but I'd known for a long time that our relationship was deteriorating. They'd been making comments for years about how I was a disappointment, how I wasn't living up to their expectations, how I owed them for everything they'd done. The tension had been escalating ever since I started making my own life decisions instead of following their prescribed path. My father wanted me to go to medical school. I went into technical support instead. My mother wanted me involved in her church activities and social groups. I stopped attending after college. They wanted me to date Claire's friends and join their country club. I did neither. Every choice I made that diverged from their vision created more resentment. The thing is, my parents are obsessed with image and status, what the family thinks, what their friends think. They needed everyone to see them as perfect parents with perfect children living perfect lives. I wasn't cooperating with that narrative anymore, so they decided to publicly eject me from it. What they didn't count on was that I'm actually very good at my job. Daniel firing me was a problem that would solve itself once I contacted his regional manager, whom I'd worked with directly on several major accounts. Daniel had no legitimate grounds for termination, and my parents certainly couldn't provide any valid performance concerns. The car was annoying but not devastating. It was a 2015 sedan with 130,000 miles that needed new brakes. Claire could have it. The $114,000 bill was legally meaningless. Parents can't invoice their children for raising them. That document had zero enforceability. It was purely theatrical. What my parents didn't realize was that their theatrical production had witnesses, over 30 witnesses who'd watched them humiliate their son on his birthday. Some of those witnesses had their own complicated relationships with Robert and Patricia. Some of them had questions about where certain family money had gone over the years. Some of them remembered things my parents probably wished they'd forgotten. I spent Thursday night making a list. I spent Friday researching. By Saturday, I had phone numbers and email addresses. By Sunday, I'd drafted several carefully worded messages. Friday morning, my phone started ringing. Patricia first, then Robert, then Claire. I let every call go to voicemail. The first few messages were angry. How dare I walk out without saying anything? How dare I embarrass them in front of the family? Did I think I could just ignore them? By Friday afternoon, the tone shifted. They needed to talk to me. It was important. There were things they needed to explain. Could I please just answer the phone? Saturday, the calls got desperate. Patricia left a voicemail saying there had been some misunderstandings at the dinner. Things had gotten out of hand. They hadn't meant for it to go that way. She wanted to meet for coffee to clear the air. Sunday morning, Robert left a message saying they'd made some mistakes in how they'd handled things. He wanted to discuss everything calmly and figure out a path forward as a family. Sunday evening, Claire sent me 12 text messages in a row. Mom and Dad were freaking out. Relatives were calling them asking questions. Some people were saying awful things. Grandma was upset. I needed to call them back right now and tell everyone that I was fine and that we were working things out. I didn't respond to any of it. Because here's what was happening. Those carefully worded messages I'd sent out Sunday morning were making their way through the family network. Certain relatives were having certain conversations. Questions were being asked about financial decisions Robert had made over the years. Questions about why Patricia's mother's estate had been distributed the way it was. Questions about what really happened with Claire's college fund. I wasn't breaking any laws. I wasn't making anything up. I was simply making sure the right people knew to ask the right questions about things that had actually happened. Things my parents had very carefully kept quiet. Things they'd hidden behind their perfect family image. The calls kept coming. 470, 390, 230. I have them all saved. Every voicemail where the panic escalates. Every text message where Claire tries different tactics to get me to respond. They wanted to talk. They wanted to explain. They wanted me to make it stop. I wasn't going to make it stop. I was going to make it worse. It's been 8 days since the birthday dinner, and I need to provide an update because this situation has taken turns I didn't fully anticipate. The calls haven't stopped. I'm now at 89 missed calls from Patricia, 71 from Robert, and 46 from Claire. But that's not even the most interesting part anymore. Let me explain what those messages I sent actually were. I didn't fabricate anything or spread lies. What I did was reach out to specific relatives with specific questions about specific events that had happened over the years, events my parents had carefully controlled the narrative around. My uncle Marcus, Robert's younger brother, received a message asking if he'd ever gotten the $15,000 that Grandma Helen had left him in her will. According to the will I'd seen at Grandma's house years ago when I was helping her organize documents, Marcus was supposed to receive that money. I'd always wondered why he never mentioned it. My Aunt Sarah, Patricia's sister, received a message asking what had happened to the proceeds from selling their mother's house after she passed. Their mother had lived in that house for 40 years. It sold for $290,000. Sarah had mentioned once at Thanksgiving that she'd never seen any of that money. My cousin Kevin, different from Daniel. This is Marcus's son. Received a message asking if he knew what happened to the college fund that our grandmother had set up for all the grandchildren. She'd established it back in 2005 with explicit instructions that each grandchild would receive an equal share when they turned 18. I didn't tell anyone what to do with this information. I just asked questions. Questions that got people thinking about things they'd been too polite or too conflict-averse to pursue before. Monday morning, I dealt with the job situation. I called the regional manager, a man named Victor, whom I'd worked with directly on the software migration project last year. I explained that Daniel had terminated me on Friday without cause and without following proper procedures. Victor was confused because he hadn't been notified of any termination. When I told him Daniel had made the decision based on a conversation with my parents at a family dinner, he went quiet for a long moment. Then he told me to sit tight and he'd call me back. 2 hours later, Victor called back. Daniel had been suspended pending an investigation into improper termination practices. I was being reinstated with back pay for the days I'd missed. Victor apologized for what had happened and said he'd be checking in with me personally to ensure there were no retaliation issues, so I had my job back. One problem solved. The car situation was more frustrating. I looked into my options and realized that since Robert had technically owned the vehicle and voluntarily transferred it to Claire, I had no legal recourse. It didn't matter that I'd been making the insurance payments and maintenance costs. His name was on the title. I started taking the bus to work and looking at used car listings online. Wednesday afternoon, my Uncle Marcus called me. Not texted, actually called. I answered because Marcus had always been decent to me, and I was curious what he wanted. He got straight to the point. He'd been going through old documents after I'd sent that message, and he'd found the original copy of Grandma Helen's will. He'd never received the $15,000. Robert had been the executor of the estate. Marcus had asked about it at the time, and Robert had told him the estate didn't have enough liquid assets after paying debts and funeral costs. But Marcus had just requested the estate filing documents from the county clerk's office. The estate had cleared $47,000 after all debts and expenses. Robert had filed a document stating that the full amount went to funeral costs and estate administration fees. Marcus wanted to know if I knew anything about that. I told him I didn't know the specifics, but I knew that Robert had paid off his truck around that same time and had taken Patricia on an expensive cruise to the Mediterranean. Marcus went very quiet. Then he told me he was going to be having a conversation with Robert, and he wanted me to know that he appreciated me asking the question. Thursday morning, Claire showed up at my apartment. I have no idea how she got my address since I'd moved to this place 6 months ago and hadn't shared it with any family members. She must have followed me from work or asked someone. She was standing in the hallway when I left for my bus. She looked terrible, eyes red, that frantic energy people get when they haven't been sleeping properly. She started talking immediately. Mom and Dad were going insane. Family members were calling them constantly. Uncle Marcus had shown up at the house Tuesday night with a copy of Grandma's will, and there had been a massive fight. Aunt Sarah had hired someone to look into the house sale. Cousin Kevin had contacted a lawyer about the college fund. Everyone was turning on them, and it was my fault. I asked Claire why she thought I was responsible for Robert and Patricia's decisions. She said I'd stirred everything up on purpose. I'd sent those messages to cause problems. I was trying to destroy the family because I was angry about the birthday dinner. I told her that I'd simply ask questions about things that actually happened. If those questions were causing problems, maybe she should wonder why. Claire switched tactics. She said the birthday dinner had been Dad's idea, not Mom's. She said Mom had tried to talk him out of it, but he'd been fixated on teaching me a lesson. She said they'd both been drinking before the dinner started and things had gotten out of hand. She said I needed to understand that they were under a lot of stress and I hadn't been making things easy for them. I asked her what stress I'd been causing. She got vague. Just the usual stuff. The way I'd been pulling away from the family. The way I never came to events anymore. The way I'd refused to date her friend Melissa when they'd tried to set us up. The way I'd chosen a regular job instead of pursuing something more ambitious. None of that explained the birthday dinner. None of that explained the public humiliation. None of that explained trying to get me fired from my job. Claire kept talking in circles, trying to make it sound like everyone had made mistakes and we should all just move past it. I asked her about the car keys. She looked uncomfortable. She said Dad had told her I wasn't using the car properly and that she needed a vehicle for her new job. I asked her what new job. She didn't have an answer for that. She'd been working part-time at a boutique for the past year. Nothing had changed. I asked her if she'd known about the dinner beforehand, if she'd known what they were planning. She hesitated too long before saying no. That hesitation told me everything. She'd known. Maybe not all the details, but she'd known something was going to happen. Claire tried again. She said I needed to call Mom and Dad. She said I needed to tell Uncle Marcus and Aunt Sarah and everyone else to stop asking questions. She said the family was falling apart and I was the only one who could fix it. I asked her why I would want to fix it. She didn't have an answer for that either. Friday afternoon. Patricia showed up at my workplace. I was in the break room when Victor came to find me and told me there was someone in the lobby asking for me. I went down, and there was my mother, sitting in one of the visitor chairs like she was there for a business meeting. She was dressed impeccably, hair perfect, makeup perfect, full armor. She told me we needed to talk privately. I told her we could talk right there in the lobby. She looked around at the receptionist, the security guard, the other people walking through. She said this was family business and it needed to be private. I told her she'd made our family business public when she invited 30 relatives to watch her throw my photos in the trash. If she wanted to talk to me now, she could do it here. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. She said I was being unreasonable and childish. She said she'd come here to apologize and try to work things out. But I was making it impossible. I asked her what she was apologizing for specifically. She started listing things in this performative way. She was sorry the dinner had gotten emotional. She was sorry things had been said in anger. She was sorry I'd felt hurt by what happened. I stopped her. I asked her if she was sorry for ripping my photos off the wall. She said that was part of what had gotten too emotional. Asked if she was sorry for calling me worthless and saying I'd drained them financially. She said she'd been upset and hadn't meant it that way. I asked if she was sorry for inviting my boss so he could fire me. She said that had been Robert's idea and she'd told him it was too much. Every answer was deflection. Every apology came with an excuse or an explanation or a way to shift responsibility. I asked her what she wanted from me. She said she wanted me to forgive them so we could move forward as a family. She said she wanted me to stop whatever I was doing that was making relatives ask all these questions. She said she wanted things to go back to normal. I told her there was no normal to go back to. She destroyed that at the birthday dinner. She said I was overreacting to one bad night. I asked her if she really thought this was about one bad night, or if maybe it was about 26 years of them treating me like a disappointment because I didn't live the exact life they'd planned for me. Patricia stood up. She said she'd tried to be reasonable. She'd tried to apologize, but I was determined to be difficult and vindictive. She said I was going to regret this when I realized I'd destroyed my own family over hurt feelings. Then she walked out of the lobby. Victor had watched the whole thing from the second-floor hallway. He came down afterward and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. He said if she showed up again, building security would handle it. He also mentioned that he'd filed a formal complaint about Daniel's conduct and there would be a proper review process. Saturday, my phone rang 63 times. Sunday it rang 41 times. I haven't answered any of them, but I've listened to the voicemails. They're getting more frantic and more angry simultaneously. Robert left one message where he said I was tearing apart everything he'd built. Patricia left one where she said I was being manipulative and cruel. Claire left one where she was crying, saying I was ruining her life too because now everyone was questioning her about things she didn't even know about. The thing is, I haven't done anything except ask questions about facts, about real things that really happened. If those facts are causing problems for Robert and Patricia, that's not my manipulation. That's consequences, and this is just the beginning, because I have more questions lined up. Questions about other family events, other financial decisions, other times when my parents' version of events didn't quite match reality. I've got years of observations stored up, and I've been quiet about all of it because I wanted to keep the peace. I'm done keeping the peace. Update 2. 17 days later. It's been 17 days since the birthday dinner, and the situation has exploded in ways that are honestly satisfying to watch. I'm writing this from a parking lot outside a grocery store because I needed to get out of my apartment for a while and think through what just happened. The missed calls have slowed down. I'm at 127 from Patricia, 103 from Robert, and 68 from Claire. But that's because they've moved on to different tactics. Yesterday, there was a family meeting at my grandmother's house. I wasn't invited, but I heard about every detail from 3 different sources within an hour of it ending. Let me back up to what's been happening since my last update, Uncle. Marcus filed a formal complaint with the probate court about Grandma Helen's estate. He submitted the original will and the county records showing the estate had $47,000 in liquid assets. He's demanding a full accounting of where that money went and why he never received his inheritance. Robert is now required to produce documentation or face legal consequences for mishandling the estate. Aunt Sarah hired someone to look into her mother's house sale. Turns out Patricia had been listed as the co-executor of that estate, too. The house sold for $290,000. After the mortgage payoff and estate costs, there should have been $180,000 to split between Sarah and Patricia equally. Sarah received $30,000. Patricia told her that was her full half after all the additional costs and fees. Sarah's investigator found documentation showing the full $180,000 was dispersed, with $150,000 going to an account in Patricia's name. My cousin Kevin contacted the bank that had held Grandma Helen's college fund trust. The trust had been established in 2005 with $50,000 and explicit instructions that it would be divided equally among all 5 grandchildren when each turned 18. Robert had been named as the trustee. Kevin turned 18 in 2015. He never received any money. When he asked Robert about it back then, Robert told him the fund had underperformed and been depleted by market losses and management fees. The bank provided Kevin with the full trust history. The fund had actually grown to $73,000 by 2015. There were 5 withdrawals between 2015 and 2020, each one coinciding with a grandchild's 18th birthday. Each withdrawal was for the full amount in the account at that time. All 5 withdrawals went to an account owned by Robert and Patricia. So now there are 3 separate situations where my parents were in charge of family money, and that money disappeared. I didn't make any of this happen. I just asked the questions that got people looking at records they should have looked at years ago. Tuesday afternoon, Claire showed up at my apartment again. This time she brought someone with her, a tall man wearing an expensive suit. Claire introduced him as her lawyer friend, who was here to help us work things out. I asked Claire why we needed a lawyer to talk. She said things had gotten complicated and someone neutral needed to mediate before everything got worse. The lawyer, whose name I immediately forgot, started talking about family reconciliation and how litigation between family members never ends well for anyone. He said he'd reviewed the situation and there were clearly some misunderstandings that could be cleared up through honest communication. He suggested we all sit down, together, parents and children, and discuss everything, calmly with him present to keep things productive. I asked him who was paying him. He said he was doing this as a favor to Claire. I asked Claire how she'd met this lawyer. She got vague again. He was someone she'd met through friends. He'd offered to help when he'd heard about our family issues. I asked him directly who had actually contacted him first. He said Claire had reached out, but that Patricia had provided him with background information about the situation. So, my mother had gotten Claire to bring a lawyer to my apartment to try to convince me to sit down for a mediated conversation. I told them I wasn't interested. The lawyer said I was making a mistake. He said families who let conflicts escalate into legal battles often destroy relationships permanently. I told him the relationships were already destroyed, and that happened at a birthday dinner 17 days ago. Claire started crying, real tears this time, not the performative kind. She said I was ruining everything. She said Mom and Dad were falling apart. She said Uncle Marcus wasn't speaking to them. She said Aunt Sarah had screamed at Mom over the phone for 20 minutes. She said the whole family was choosing sides and she was stuck in the middle. She said I needed to fix this because I was the one who'd started it. I asked Claire if she'd known about any of the missing money, the inheritance that Marcus never got, the house sale proceeds that Sarah never saw, the college fund that disappeared. She said she didn't know anything about any of that. I asked her if she believed Mom and Dad had legitimate explanations for where all that money went. She Said there had to be explanations. She said Mom and Dad weren't thieves. She said there were probably just misunderstandings and paperwork errors. I asked her if she really believed that or if she was just trying to convince herself. She didn't answer. The lawyer tried to jump back in with more mediation talk. I told them both to leave. Claire kept crying. The lawyer left his business card on my kitchen counter. They left. Wednesday, I got a text from my grandmother. Not a call, a text, which was unusual because she's 81 and barely knows how to use her phone. The text said she wanted to see me. She said the family was meeting at her house on Saturday afternoon and I needed to be there. She said it was important and she wasn't asking. I texted back asking if Robert and Patricia would be there. She said everyone would be there. I asked if this was an ambush. She said it was a family meeting to address serious issues and my presence was required. I told her I'd think about it. Thursday, Patricia called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I thought it might be work-related. She started talking immediately. She said I'd won. She said I'd successfully turned the family against them. She said I'd destroyed their reputation and their relationships with everyone they cared about. She said I must be very proud of myself. I asked her if she was calling to blame me for the consequences of her own actions. She said I'd manipulated the situation to make them look bad. She said I'd asked questions in a way that made people suspicious when there were perfectly reasonable explanations for everything. I asked her what the reasonable explanation was for keeping Marcus's $15,000 inheritance. She said the estate had debts I didn't know about. I asked her what the reasonable explanation was for keeping $120,000 of Sarah's house sale money. She said there had been additional estate expenses that Sarah didn't understand. I asked her why she'd never explained these expenses to Marcus and Sarah before, why she'd let them believe they'd received their full inheritances. She said it was complicated and I wouldn't understand because I'd never been responsible for managing family estates. I told her she was right. I didn't understand how someone could steal from their own family members and sleep at night. Patricia's tone shifted completely. She said I had no idea what I was talking about. She said she and Robert had sacrificed everything for this family. She said they'd put everyone else first for decades. She said if they'd used some of that money for their own needs, they'd earned it through years of taking care of everyone else's problems. I asked her if Marcus and Sarah knew they'd earned the right to take money that wasn't theirs. She hung up. Friday morning, Robert called from the same unknown number. He tried a different approach. He said he knew I was angry about the birthday dinner. He said he'd handled things poorly, and he regretted the way he'd approached the situation. He said he'd been trying to teach me a lesson about responsibility and gratitude, but he'd gone too far. He said he wanted to make things right. I asked him what making things right looked like. He said we could sit down as a family and talk through everything. He said we could work out the issues with Marcus and Sarah and Kevin. He said there were explanations for the financial questions people were raising, and he wanted a chance to explain them properly. He said if I came to the family meeting on Saturday, he'd answer any questions I had, and we could start rebuilding trust. I asked him if he'd be writing Marcus a check for $15,000. He said it wasn't that simple. I asked him if he'd be writing Sarah a check for $120,000. He said the estate situations were legally complex and required proper documentation and review. I asked him if he'd be returning the money from the college fund that was supposed to go to 5 grandchildren. He said that money had been used for family expenses over the years and there was no pool of cash sitting somewhere to return. So basically, he wanted me to come to a family meeting where he'd explain why he was justified in keeping money that belonged to other people. I told him I wasn't interested in his explanations. He said I owed him the chance to defend himself. I told him he'd had 17 days to defend himself, and instead he'd spent that time calling me 103 times and sending Claire with a lawyer to pressure me. He said I was being unreasonable and vindictive. I hung up. Saturday morning, I got 6 more texts from Claire. She was begging me to come to Grandma's house. She said everyone would be there and this was my chance to hear Mom and Dad's side of things. She said if I didn't come, I was proving that I didn't actually care about the truth and just wanted to cause problems. She said Grandma was upset that I was refusing to attend. She said I was making everything worse by staying away. I didn't go to the family meeting, Instead, I sat in my apartment and waited for the updates I knew would come. At 3:47 p.m., Mr. I got a text from Cousin Kevin. The meeting had been a disaster. Robert and Patricia had tried to explain the financial situations but couldn't produce any actual documentation to support their claims. Uncle Marcus had brought his lawyer. Aunt Sarah had brought her investigator's report. They'd confronted Robert and Patricia with specific numbers and dates and demands for accountability. According to Kevin, Robert had started yelling that everyone was ganging up on them over misunderstandings. Patricia had cried and said they'd given their whole lives to this family and this was how they were being repaid. Claire had defended them and said everyone was being unfair. Grandma had tried to keep order but eventually gave up. Marcus and Sarah had both said they were pursuing legal action. Robert had said if that's what they wanted, he'd fight them in court. Everyone had left angry. At 4:15 p.m., I got a voice message from Grandma. She said she was disappointed I hadn't come to the meeting. She said families need to face problems together, not run away from them. She said I'd started this situation and I had a responsibility to see it through. She said she didn't know what I thought I was accomplishing, but I was tearing the family apart. I sat there in my apartment and listened to that message 3 times. My grandmother, who I'd always loved and respected, was blaming me for tearing the family apart. Not Robert for taking money that wasn't his. Not Patricia for lying about estate distributions. Not the two of them for publicly humiliating me at a birthday dinner. Me, for asking questions about where money went. That's when I realized they'd gotten to her too. They'd convinced her that the real problem wasn't what they'd done, but the fact that I'd exposed it. And if they'd convinced her, they were probably trying to convince everyone else the same way. I'm not backing down. This meeting wasn't the end. It was just confirmation that Robert and Patricia have no intention of taking actual responsibility for what they've done. They want to manage the narrative and make themselves the victims. But I've got more moves to make because here's what they don't know yet. I've been collecting receipts of my own. Documentation of every time they've lied about me to other people. Every time they've twisted situations to make themselves look good. Every time they've used family relationships to manipulate and control people. And I'm about to start sharing that documentation. GR, final update. 29 days later. It's been 29 days since the birthday dinner. This is probably my last update because the situation has reached a point where there's not much left to say. Robert and Patricia are facing consequences they can't talk or manipulate their way out of. Claire has finally had to accept some uncomfortable truths, and I'm exactly where I plan to be. The week after the failed family meeting, things accelerated rapidly. Uncle Marcus filed a formal petition with the probate court demanding a full investigation into how Grandma Helen's estate was handled. Aunt Sarah filed a civil suit against Patricia for the missing $120,000 from their mother's house sale. Cousin Kevin and the other grandchildren retained a lawyer to pursue recovery of the college fund money. My parents hired their own lawyer, an expensive one based on what Claire told me when she showed up at my apartment for the 3rd time. She was frantic. She said Mom and Dad were drowning in legal fees. She said they were going to have to sell the house to pay for their defense. She said this was all spiraling out of control, and I was the only one who could stop it by telling everyone to drop their cases. I asked Claire why she thought I had that power. She said because everyone knew I'd started this. She said if I publicly stated I'd been wrong to raise questions and that I believed Mom and Dad had reasonable explanations, then the family would back off. I asked her if she actually believed Mom and Dad had reasonable explanations for taking money that belonged to other people. She said there had to be explanations we didn't understand. I told Claire I was done protecting her from reality. I pulled out my phone and showed her something I'd been holding on to. Screenshots of text conversations between Patricia and Claire from 2 months before the birthday dinner. Messages where Patricia was complaining about me, saying I was an embarrassment to the family, saying I needed to be taught a lesson about respect and gratitude, saying she and Robert were planning something that would put me in my place. Claire's face went white. She said she didn't remember those conversations. I scrolled through more messages. Ones where Claire agreed that I'd been difficult. Ones where she said maybe a wake-up call would be good for me. Ones where she asked what Mom and Dad were planning, and Patricia said it would be a birthday I'd never forget. I asked Claire if she still wanted to claim she didn't know anything about the birthday dinner beforehand. She started crying again. She said she hadn't known the specific details. She said she'd thought they were just going to have a serious conversation with me,